Well, hello and good afternoon to the World Wide Web. We appreciate you joining us for the 2022 Outlook for Incentive Travel. And I am one of your speakers. I am Mike May, president of Brightspot. I'm also the past chairman of the Incentive Research Foundation, which I'd give a plug to the IRF and say, if you're not already following their research, you should go to theirf.org and register, and you will get a monthly email of some of the very best research on incentives and motivational meetings that exist anywhere on the planet. My co-host today is Stan Hershenow, an account executive here, and Stan is also on the board of trustees of SITE Foundation. So welcome, Stan.
Thanks, Mike.
Stan,
thank you, everybody.
Exactly? Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, what exactly is SITE Foundation?
SITE Foundation is a Society for Incentive Travel Excellence, and it's a global organization that includes people on all sides of the business dedicated to incentive travel. The foundation is the sourcing arm to SITE, and we raise money that supports the research, the education for incentive travel. We're the only dedicated organization for incentive travel.
Yeah, good. Well, I know those initials after your name have something to do with the certifications that SITE Foundation puts out. Is that correct?
It is correct, Mike. And for those that haven't gone through the certification process, we encourage you to do that. The first one is Certified Incentive Specialist, and then the second level is Certified Incentive Travel Professional. And we think they're great ways to advance your knowledge and your career through the certification process.
Super. Okay, let's see. So, quick public service announcement. We're going to have a couple of important upcoming webinars next week on Wednesday. We are going to do the 2022 Outlook for road shows, which I guess could also be known as customer hospitality events, lead generation events, local marketing, field marketing, even account-based marketing. So, as live events are rebounding, we're seeing road shows and field marketing events rebound. And then some point in January 22, we always do a kind of a New Year's resolution for incentives and events. And we outline what we think the actionable to-dos are that the market should be doing. So stay tuned for that. We'd love to get any questions, Q&A today. So while we're speaking, please click the Q&A button and send in questions. And whoever submits the best question in the judgment of our marketing department will be awarded a $50 gift card. So with that, we're going to start quickly at what we're calling tipping points that have occurred during the course of 2021, especially over the last 2 quarters. And we use the term tipping points based on the book by Malcolm Gladwell that some of you might be familiar with. And Malcolm defined a tipping point as the magic moment when an idea, trend, or social behavior crosses a threshold and tips and spreads like wildfire. We certainly saw a negative tipping point that occurred back in March of 2020, where that COVID virus tipped the seesaw and shut down live events and shut down offices and restaurants and every sporting events back in March 2020. During the course of this year, probably around the middle of the year, the teeter-totter tipped the other way and people started coming out, companies started coming out and reinvigorating their event marketing. I would say July 4 was kind of the tipping point in North America, and Independence Day in North America was also our Independence Day from staying inside the 4 walls of our home and getting out and doing events. So a couple of things as it relates to the incentive travel space. IRF and SITE that we both referenced did a joint study and predicted that 60% of trips would operate in the back half of this year. That is exactly what Stan and I have been seeing. The other stat that we would share, just to give you a sense of where we are today, is in Q3 and Q4, of those that win the right to travel, we're seeing that 75 to 90% of those that win will opt to travel. It's probably in the 90% range when we were in Q4 of this year, or when the trip was domestic or Mexico. If the trip was a little earlier in the year in Q3 or a little farther away, we might have seen that 75%. But I think it's interesting because it reflects consumer confidence. The other interesting tidbit reflecting consumer confidence is over the Thanksgiving holiday in the United States, the travelers through TSA checkpoints set a pre-pandemic record. So it was the highest of any number of travelers since that mid-March date. So I think what that shows is consumers are back, ready to go. And part of the reason is, as we know, so many people have been vaccinated. While the news likes to quote the left stat and say only 59% are fully vaccinated, if we look at the adult population, it's actually 82%. And then I believe you could add another 10% to that number for people that, while not vaccinated, they have COVID antibodies from recovery. So that superpower from vaccination is what is starting to drive events. So with that, we'll start with Outlook. And maybe, Stan, before we do, I feel like the elephant in the room is the Omicron variants. What are you seeing? What are you thinking before we dive in as it relates to Omicron?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point too, going back to the vaccination rates. And I think what we're finding is they're really becoming very important and somewhat critical when it comes to the execution of programs. First, many destinations are requiring those vaccinations for entry. And then secondly, a lot of companies are requiring them to participate in their trips. And so regardless of what your personal feelings might be about vaccinations, it's clear that they'll play an important role, I think, in the restart for incentive programs, certainly in the short term, I would think. And in fact, North Star, some of you might pay attention to their pulse surveys. And in the most recent one, that I believe was back in October, for Q4, it indicated that over half of the respondents required vaccination to participate in the program. And then Site did a similar survey called Corporate Insights, which is a survey that targets corporate planners. And in their most recent series, the requirement of vaccination certification was one of the top three elements that influence incentive travel for U.S. corporations. So clearly, many companies see vaccinations as a gateway toward, I think, safe program operations. When it comes to Omicron, I think it might be too early to know. I think we're all somewhat encouraged by some of the news that's out there, some of the more recent news that it may not be as severe as some of the other variants. And I know at Brightspot, fortunately, at least to date, we haven't seen a change in program operations in the last couple of weeks. But I think it's still too early, and I think we can all hope that from a media perspective, that there'll be a consistent message that'll be pushed out around the world, and then destinations can base their decisions on more factual, scientific-based information.
Yeah, I agree. I know, Stan, when we were prepping for this, you made a great point that the stock market over the last 2 days voted its confidence, and the S&P was up 3 or 4%. Travel stocks were up about 10%. So the smart money on Wall Street is definitely banking that and voting that this is going to pass fairly quickly. Well, let's jump into our content. Sorry, Stan, I was going to say whatever you want and then take it away with Nearer in 22.
Sure. I was just going to say, I think some of the medical experts, the people that we've kind of relied on, I think, to guide us through this process, they've also, fortunately, kind of toned down the critical nature of Omicron. But again, we'll see. I think we'll all kind of watch this closely and see how it progresses. So now that business is coming back and we are seeing a return with incentive trips, it stands to reason that a majority of U.S. events that are taking place are doing so closer to home within the borders. And then when U.S. companies do go outside the U.S., many are booking regions such as Mexico and the Caribbean. Again, going back to some of these surveys we've been watching, that North Star Pulse survey from October showed that 80% of the respondents were either operating or planning programs in the U.S., Mexico, or Caribbean. So a very, very high percentage staying close to home. If there's any listeners from Europe on the call, it did show an ever so slight uptick in Europe sourcing, so that was good to see. So again, while programs may be staying closer to home in early 2022, signs do point to the world opening up and long-haul programs coming back in late 22 and certainly by 23. And to that point, this graphic is from the Site Foundation's Corporate Insight study, and it kind of validates that point. The respondents are all corporate planners, as I mentioned, and they were asked when and where they would be planning their next meeting or incentive trip. And if you focus just on the light blue bar, portion of the bar, you'll see that almost 90% of the planners plan to operate a domestic incentive by the end of Q2 next year, and that's compared to 70% for international destinations. I think it's important to point out that this second survey, we received a greater number of responses from corporate planners from financial insurance sector, and thus it may account for a greater overall note of caution compared to other research that we're seeing. But the good news is that, as you can see, by 2023, 100% of the respondents do plan to operate either a domestic or an international program. And I noticed in a different survey by meetings and conventions, they actually put out a 2022 forecast, and they were forecasting that by the end of 22, 70% of the meetings industry would return business, and then there'd be a full recovery by mid-2023. So the point is, regardless of the publication of the survey, I think they're all reporting similar outlooks, Mike.
Yep.
So as the world does reopen, the question is, where are companies looking in 2022 and beyond? And I think this slide shows a sample of some of the destinations that we at Brightspot are sourcing and booking for our clients. And it's nice to see the return of many destinations that have long been considered hotspots for incentive travel. And I think it's also interesting and exciting to see that in that insight survey that was done by the foundation, appeal of destination actually reclaimed the number one reason for destination selection over safety. And it's not to suggest that safety is not important. It certainly is. And it was a close second in terms of things that are important. But it's nice to see us getting back to more traditional criteria. Earlier this week, and I posted this out on LinkedIn for anybody that might follow me on LinkedIn, but Condé Nast published an article showing a new batch of international destinations that have reopened for vaccinated travelers. And it was a great list. It included places like Fiji, the Cayman Islands. So I think we've all been waiting for the Caymans to reopen. India, Malaysia, Vietnam, Grenada. And then when you pair this list with places that are already reopened, such as France, Greece, UK, Italy, Croatia, and then you throw in some Central and South America destinations like Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, and you can finally start seeing that there's a lot of wonderful options for companies to consider, and the world is, in fact, reopening.
Stan, what it intrigued me, the list of some of the places we're seeing and hearing more interest in are kind of what we would call second tier Europe. And that was a trend we saw before, but I think it's one that's continuing as we come to this post-pandemic era, because maybe people feel like, oh, there's not as many people in these aren't quite as touristy as the major cities within Europe, but certainly, it's certainly encouraging to see. Well, our next outlook for 2022 that we see is just more outdoor events. And I don't think this surprises anybody. We've been hearing this in our space to try to do things that are out in the open air, but it gives people more peace of mind more well-being. So there's more cocktail receptions that are occurring out on a patio rather than in a ballroom, or just things that get people outdoors and get them out into the breeze. So we definitely see that continuing through 2022 as well. Then another interesting trend we're seeing, I think, is around personalization.
I agree, Mike. This is an interesting topic. For the past couple of years leading up to the pandemic, I think we started to see changes in the makeup of incentive trips. Some of those larger group gatherings or activities were being replaced with more personalized offerings, smaller gatherings, and more choice was being built into program designs. And some feel this might have been driven by a younger participant that has different values or interests. No doubt the pandemic certainly emphasized the need for smaller gatherings. And I think looking ahead, we see the idea of personalization becoming really the norm, with fewer gatherings and more freedom to explore a destination your way. And there's still value in gathering as a group, for whether it be a welcome reception or functions with recognition built in or addresses by the leadership. But we believe that personalization of experience will drive a lot of program design in the years ahead, and for, I think, a lot of good reasons. A good practice that I'm sure most of our planners are already doing is to poll and survey your audience on a regular basis to find out really what's most important to them, and then build that program design around their interests with variety and choice.
Yeah, good. I know. We're still definitely in the midst of this. This pandemic. It's trailing off. I want to be cautious that we're not saying, "Hey, none of this ever occurred," but we're in that transition stage of easing back into a post-pandemic world. So people need to go through a little bit of a thought process here of what they are comfortable with. And with that, it's a tremendous time for companies to take advantage of this pause and relook at their strategy. As some politicians have said, you never want to let a crisis go to waste. But I think in this case, it's just great for companies to reassess. So often we get into a cycle of repeating what had happened. So we're working with our clients to try to ask them again, okay, what are your goals? How have the goals changed from what they were a few years ago? Has your sales audience changed? Is the products you're changing? Are they changing? Are they moving from hardware to software? Are they moving from physical to virtual? And should that affect the qualification rules of how people achieve? Also, considering the audience preferences. I know, Stan, you've been in this space for a while. There used to be a bit of an anecdote that said the President's Club trip location is chosen by the CEO's spouse. And while that's probably not true, I think many times it is the VPs and the CEOs that are making the decision, and their preference may be different than the audience. And then the other thing I think we're seeing is clients starting to move to some sort of rotation that may be something that it goes from Hawaii over to the Caribbean, over to Europe, back to Hawaii, especially ones where the audience is global. We see where they may flip between Europe one year, North America another year. Just a good time to reassess. And then, Stan, this is your area of expertise since you worked a little bit in the hotel industry at one point. But when we say compression, what do we mean?
Well, I think for anybody that sourced an event in the past few months, especially in the closer to home popular incentive destinations, they probably have experienced compression. And I think it's caused by a few different reasons. The current compression that we're dealing with. First, you had postponement of programs from 2020 and early 2021 that were moved into the latter part of 21 and the first half of 22. Secondly, you have this temporary shrinking of the world that we talked about earlier, with more programs staying closer to home. And then finally, I think we all maybe even participated in this robust leisure demand that kind of came storming back in 2021. And that leisure demand, especially in many of the popular incentive destination resort areas, really yielded some unprecedented rates that for many hotels. And I think even those, especially the smaller hotels, they've maybe at least temporarily altered their normal mix of business, where a hotel might have been 50% group, 50% leisure. At least temporarily, they're leaning more toward the leisure side because that's come back the quickest. And so I think when you add all that up, you end up with this compression that the outcome is limited or no availability, and certainly higher than expected rates in many of these popular incentive destinations in the U.S., Mexico, and the Caribbean especially. So I think our advice here, Mike, is don't wait. If your general timeline for sourcing an event is 1 year in advance, we'd recommend you start the process early, especially for 2023 dates. Additionally, you may need to make some adjustments to the budget, especially for those big ticket items such as airfare and hotel rates. If you are going to look and explore some of those popular destinations, and you mentioned earlier these second tier destinations, and I think this might be a great opportunity for those that are open to these second tier locations to consider those where right now there's less U.S. demand in those areas. And I think about South and Central America. We mentioned some of those destinations that are reopening, and it might be a great time to explore those options and maybe push that first tier option out another year or two. And again, sourcing it early, but where you might be able to take advantage of a little bit more value.
Yeah, that's good. It seems like it's been an odd year because I think some consumer mentality for a while was, oh, things have been shut down, therefore there'll be bargains. But in Q2, everybody decided to start traveling again, and there was a lot of what was called revenge travel. And I remember being in the Palm Beaches area, and they said that April was a record month. And at first I thought they meant record for 2021 or record since the pandemic. And I clarified, and the person I was talking to is like, no, for our hotel, April 2021 was an all-time record in revenue forever. And I was shocked because I was like, okay, you're not getting group business, but what it reflected is they were getting what you said, Stan, so much leisure business that's at a higher rate than what groups pay. And I was like, wow, that's a couple of us on the meeting planning side whispered and said, we hope that the revenue manager doesn't think that'll last forever or they won't respond to our RFPs for groups. So.
Right.
Well, good. Well, let's see. We are going to ease into the Q&A session. We always like to leave some time for the audience to ask some questions. They usually ask the best questions that represent what's on everybody's mind. So as a reminder, you can click the Q&A button and send in a question. And it doesn't take very many questions to have a chance to win because we usually only get a handful. So the best one will get a $50 gift card. So please send in your questions. And while you're thinking and typing, I want to share two really good resources on the Brightspot website for what we talked about. There is an ebook called Tips to Improve an Incentive Travel Program, which is really got some of the best ideas that anywhere on our website. You see a short link at the bottom where you can go to gobrightspot.com/improve trip. And then on the right side is our list of best U.S. destinations to consider for a domestic incentive travel program. That's been a really popular resource this year. So take a look at those if those are topics of interest. And with that, we will now start the Q&A. Let's see, Sebastian, do you have a question for us?
Yes, I have a question that I have here for you guys. So how do you feel about the Omicron variant? How will it affect incentive travel in the near future?
Yeah, good. We tried to cover that a little, but I would say, in addition, I know what Stan said, we talked about the stock market and what certain doctors, but I did see this week that Dr. Fauci, who seems to be the go-to source on these things, said, it looks like this Omicron will be very contagious, but it will not be very deadly. I heard another scientist that said if a virus is contagious, it's probably not deadly, because if it was deadly, people would quickly be in the hospital or in serious medical condition, and therefore not out and about with serious symptoms where they could infect others. So I thought that was just something, we've heard everything at this point, it feels like, but I thought that was an interesting point from a scientist, that deadly pretty much means not very contagious.
Yeah, I think too, it's.
Should we go back to Sebastian?
I do have another question. It looks like that came in. How do you feel compression? Excuse me. Do you feel compression will happen again? When will compression finally ease off?
You want to take that one, Stan?
Yeah, sure. When you think about how compression happens, it's the whole supply and demand. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's so much demand right now on select locations, which is creating this compression. So as the world reopens, which I think we've shown today that it is, and as companies start venturing out beyond those closer to home destinations, then you'll naturally see that compression go down. This isn't the first time that there's been, compression effect in our industry, and certainly won't be the last. But I do think it's just a matter of economics, and I think it will pass. You can avoid compression by pushing your programs out further. You have control over whether or not you want compression to factor into your sourcing and your selection process. I think in terms of where you look in the world and what dates you're looking at, if you're flexible and you can move to less traditional dates for your incentives, stay out of Q1 perhaps in some of the sunny destinations, then you'll probably find less compression. And so there are ways to work around it for sure.
Stan, I know you went through the 2009 financial crisis in this space. And after that, there was some compression due to the lack of new development. And I feel like we could see that phenomenon again in 2024, that if the economy continues to gain momentum, and then you overlay that with not very much development occurring in the last 2 years, and then it'll take a while for the development pipeline to get churning again, that we could see 24 or 25 having some compression due to a limited supply of new properties.
Yeah, certainly it could be the case. And I've always believed there's so many options out there, and I think a lot of us look at the same options for good reason. They're popular. They generate the interest that I think we want for our incentive programs. And but I think there's so many options out there. And that's where, not to put a sales plug in for a Brightspot or another travel company, but I think that's where we've got some great resources. We've got the knowledge, I think, to maybe introduce other options, or I think buying power comes into play here, where just from sheer volume, we have an opportunity to potentially negotiate, a more attractive deal for a customer. But I also think we just have knowledge of some other places that might be a little bit off the radar.
Good. So I know I've seen a few more questions come in. Stan and I will stay a few more minutes. We want to be respectful of people's time. We were targeting 3 o'clock to end on Central Time, but Sebastian, what's our next question?
Next question I have here, do you see more companies giving away cash prizes or experiences versus doing incentive travel in 2022?
I feel like that. I feel like that has kind of passed. Companies, did that in 2020, a little bit less in 21, but I think in 22, that is going to disappear. Again, as we saw earlier, that Stan shared, we're getting up into the 80 and 90 percentile of companies that are operating trips. I personally, of our clients, it's probably about 95% will be doing trips next year. I think the only ones weren't is if there's a company that was in an industry that was adversely impacted by COVID that they're just not able to track their rules. So I don't think they'll do a wholesale alternative price. I think where it'll be a little bit of a tricky question for people is we shared that 75 to 90% of people are opting in to travel when they're awarded. What do you do with that 10% that chooses not? We've seen some clients that just say, hey, we understand, hope to see you next year. And then we've seen a couple more that have offered an alternative award. When they do offer an alternative award, we highly recommend that the alternative award be devalued. If the value of the trip is worth 10 or 15,000 per couple, you don't do a cash prize that big or a merchandise prize that big. Maybe it's a $2,500 merchandise prize or something, because sales leaders don't want the winners showing up all the way out in 2023 saying, hey, can I have the alternative prize, because of the benefits of getting people together face to face to celebrate and network. So I don't think we're going to see very much of that at all. Sebastian, what do you got next, sir?
I've got another question here. Since the compression seems to be high in resorts, what are your thoughts about city center incentives, especially for 2022, 2023?
What do you think, Stan?
I love the idea of going to city centers, and I think you'll find they welcome the RFP. Previously, the challenge with city centers was because of the high concentration, dense population. I think they were kind of ruled out by many companies because of the pandemic. I'd like to think that as we move toward more vaccinated people and a better understanding of this pandemic, that companies will be more open to urban centers. And let's face it, there's some great ones within our country, certainly, and beyond, that I think would be great for an incentive trip and potentially seeing less demand right now. We didn't talk much about business travel, but business travel has been somewhat on hold, and I think still is. And so a lot of those cities that have been accustomed to that business travel demand, they aren't seeing that right now. So another reason, if you're open to a city area, a city center, I think it's another reason to maybe explore that.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think especially some of those cities that rank high in consumer travel magazines like Travel and Leisure. If you think of a city like Charleston or Santa Fe or Savannah, or one of my other favorites is Quebec City up in Canada, where there's a beautiful Fairmont Chateau Frontenac. And I know Quebec City likes to say, go to Europe without the jet lag. And Quebec City is a beautiful place, and not many people have been. So I think those are some creative alternatives that companies can do, and during this strategy reset. Well, Sebastian, I think I'm seeing that our Q&A window has been that we've responded. Is that all the questions we got today?
We do have a third question. That's totally up to you. Would you like to answer it?
Yeah, sure. Let's go.
This one goes like this. I'm already feeling like I'm last to the party. How do you suggest I manage expectations?
Yeah, one of the things we're seeing is lead times are challenging. Certainly, A company like Brightspot can assist with the sourcing, and we can send out a lot of electronic RFPs. But when we send those, many of the hotel sales teams have been thinned out a little bit after COVID, and they're rebuilding, or they have a whole lot of event agencies like us and companies that are hitting them with RFPs, and they're struggling to keep up. So probably just setting the expectation, it'll take just a little bit of time. And but as Stan said, don't wait till the perfect time. Now's the time to get going.
I'd also say don't feel like you're alone. I think there's reason why the timeline for sourcing is short. We're just now getting around to being comfortable with this. Many companies are, and so you're trying to get in that Q1, Q2 program. So you're not alone. Obviously, that's what's causing a lot of this compression. But it kind of goes back to what we said earlier. Consider a secondary city, a secondary location. Consider altering your dates, and if you have to, prep your stakeholders for the potential of additional costs just because of what's going on in the market right now.
Okay. Well, good. Well, with that, we want to thank everybody for their time. We'll conduct the drawing here in a few minutes. And but as a recap, we would summarize and say that the majority of trips are operating. 90% of winners are opting to travel. We also see that about 90% have some form of immunity. And then, in the outlook, we'll see a transition between nearer and farther with more outdoor activities, freedom of choice, as well as companies taking a reassessment of their strategy. So with that, we'll adjourn. We thank you for staying a few minutes over. We appreciate you joining us. If you have an interest in field marketing events, join us again next Wednesday. With that, have a very Merry Christmas and happy holidays.
Thank you, guys. Happy holidays.
Thank you.